Mr. President, 20 years ago this week, on June the 3rd and 4th in 1989, the world watched the Communist government of China violently crack down on peaceful demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. We all remember that. It's hard for me to believe that's been 20 years ago. One picture that's forever imprinted on our minds and our memories is that of a lone Chinese student who stood before a line of army tanks following days of violence that had resulted in hundreds killed and thousands more wounded. You know, we never did find out what happened to that young student. I assume he was taken away and tortured and killed, but we don't know that. He displayed a tremendous courage in the face of tyranny and injustice. For weeks, students had raised their voices demanding greater democracy, basic freedoms of speech and assembly, and an end to corruption. And while the photo of this student became infamous to the world as a picture of the Chinese people and their desire for true and lasting freedom and the democracy, it remained virtually unknown to the people of China due to the Chinese government's continued censorship and oppression. On March the 25th, the U.S. Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, while on a trip to China, remained silent regarding the ongoing human rights abuses there. Instead of China, talked about the government on global warming and issues like that. This week in Beijing, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, followed the Pelosi model, remaining mute on human rights abuses that are going on today and spoke only of environmental issues. In 2005, I gave a series of speeches on the threat that China poses to our nation. And now, 4 years later, we are in a position where they are the largest holder of our national debt, and my concerns regarding China remain the same. You know, Mr. President, I've spent many years in activity in Africa, primarily sub-Saharan Africa. And right now, we are competing with China for the energy that is in there. China is doing a better job than we are. And they are competitors of ours, not just militarily, but economically. It's of grave concern to me that as we continue to grow in our relationship and dependence on China, our U.S. government officials seem to place more value on the Chinese government's treatment of the environment than the treatment of their own people and the threat they pose to our nation. On the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Massacre, Pelosi and Geithner's omission is a disgrace to the memory of those that stood and many who died as they pleaded with the government to allow them basic freedoms that we as Americans possess and enjoy. Sadly, ignoring these issues is exactly what the government of Beijing wants. They would like nothing more than to erase the memory of Tiananmen Square Massacre from our minds, from the minds of all people around the world. And the Chinese government would like us to forget that in June of 1989, they used lethal force of 300,000 troops strong to crush peaceful protesters who were seeking greater freedoms. The Chinese government would like the image of that courageous man standing before the line of tanks to fade from our memory. However, we can't forget the hundreds that were murdered, thousands that were injured, and the more than 20,000 people who were arrested and detained without trial due to the suspected involvement in protests, and specifically in Tiananmen Square. And we don't know today where those people are. Most likely they're still incarcerated someplace or they've been killed. The Communist government is so bent on wanting us to forget these issues that they have shut down blogs, blocking access to individual news sources such as Twitter, and denied access to popular sites such as YouTube. Since Tiananmen Square, China has continued to increase severe cultural suppression of ethnic minorities such as the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the increased persecution of the Chinese Christians, the Falun Gong, and other religious groups, and other minorities, increased detention and harassment of dissidents and journalists, and maintain tight controls on freedom of speech and access to the internet. We know of journalists who right now are still incarcerated over there, but no trace of exactly where they are. And despite the promises to the contrary, China didn't provide greater access to the international media during the 2008 Olympic Games. Unlike the previous hosts of the past Games, the government in Beijing blocked access to certain internet sites and media outlets in an attempt to censor free speech. As China grows economically and continues to exert its influence globally and thus considers itself a significant player in the world stage, I believe China should be held to a standard of political, religious, and ethical responsibility. Our country was founded by those who were seeking basic freedoms, and we've got to stand for those who are doing the same in other countries. And when basic freedoms can be practiced, countries thrive and prosper because people are allowed to choose a better way of life for themselves. We must also recognize the danger we place ourselves in by becoming closer and more dependent upon nations who continue to silence their people, deny them access to information and the ability to practice their cultures and beliefs. And that's what's happening today. On the occasion of the 20th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, my colleague, Senator Brown, and I have introduced Senate Resolution 167 to remember the families of the victims who were killed in the June 1989 protests, and to call on the government of China to put an end to its continuing human rights violations. Our country mustn't remain silent, and many of my fellow colleagues in the Senate who are co-sponsors of this resolution agree. This resolution calls on the Chinese government to release all prisoners still in captivity as a result of their suspected involvement in Tiananmen Square, and protests, and the release of all others that are currently being imprisoned without cause. This resolution puts the U.S. Senate on record, encouraging the Chinese government to allow freedom of speech and to access the information while ending the harassment, intimidation, and imprisonment practices that the government has carried out against those who are minorities and who seek religious freedom. We also call on our government to uphold human rights in China. Our silence only dishonors those who lost their lives and freedoms in Tiananmen Square. You know, we have this resolution right now. We have so far co-sponsors who have just found out about it and called included, in addition to Senator Brown and myself, Senators Graham, Lieberman, Kyle, Coburn, Vitter, Menendez, Webb, and Brownback. And I would encourage others to join in this message that I think is a very clear message that should be sent by the United States. You know, today, this very day, this moment, there are 150,000 people who are protesting in Hong Kong right now because of the problems that we're addressing with this resolution. So I encourage my colleagues to join in this resolution and get this message out loud and clear. Before relinquishing the floor, let me just make a comment. One of our colleagues from Illinois was talking about their desire to have these detainees from Guantanamo to come into the United States for a trial. Let me just suggest, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know this. I've spent a lot of time down there. I know the situation. I know it's a resource we have to have, we have to keep. There's no justification at all for closing Guantanamo. No justification. All you hear is, well, this came at a time when there was suspected terrorism or torture of prisoners in Gitmo, in other areas, but never in Gitmo. There hasn't been a case, a documented case of torturing that went on there. And this is a resource that we need. If we do, as my friend from Illinois suggests, in bringing them to this country, the rules of evidence are different. These are not criminals. These are detainees. And the proper place for them to be adjudicated is in the tribunals. The only place available right now is the tribunal that is set up in Gitmo. If we bring them to this country, under our laws, quite a few of those would actually be released. And when they're released, they could be released in societies. And for those people who say that we need to use some 17 areas for incarceration in the United States as opposed to using Gitmo to incarcerate these people, that would become 17 magnets for terrorist activity in the United States. We're going to have to get over this thing of everyone lining up and saying, well, we've got to close this. And this includes the president who made this in his speech last night. We've got to close the Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay. This is something we need. we have to have. The only alternative is not a pleasant one. It would end up causing release of terrorists in the United States. If that's what the senator from Illinois and the Democrats and the president wants, I think they're going to find that most people, virtually all Americans, disagree with that. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Will the